Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. This is Catherine Kenyon from the Transforming Surge Capacity Project. A very warm welcome to everybody joining us for this webinar this morning. For those of you who don't know, the webinar is being co-organised by the Transforming Surge Capacity Project alongside the CHS Alliance. I'll be handing over to Glenn O'Neill, who works with the CHS Alliance on this piece of research on how agencies are responding to slow onset emergencies in terms of their surge responses. But before I hand over to Glenn, I just wanted to say a few words about the project for those of you who haven't heard of us before. So the Transforming Surge Capacity Project is a consortium project led by ActionAid, and we're working with 11 different INGOs and 2 technical partners to build evidence and pilot new approaches to surge capacity for the sector. And particularly we're looking at how surge can be delivered in more localised and collaborative ways. And this piece of research, which was led by the CHS Alliance, is part of a selection of research pieces looking at how agencies surge for particular emergencies, but also in this particular case for a type of emergency. We're very excited to have Glenn with us here today to talk a bit more about the findings from the research. So there'll be a short presentation from Glenn, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions from the group. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Glenn, who I believe has a presentation he'll share with us. So thanks very much, Glenn.
Thanks, Kat. Hope you can all hear me. So what I'm going to do actually, if the technology works, we'll share the screen with you so you can see the presentation. As you could see for the invitation, the report is available in PDF, so you're free to download it. And the presentation, we can also share it with those who are interested. So I will just share my screen now, and hopefully all will go well. Okay. Kat, can you let me know? Can you see my screen?
Yes. Yes, you can.
Great. Thanks a lot. So basically, I'm just going to go through the main points of this presentation, and it'll probably last about 15-20 minutes maximum. As Kat introduced, I'm one of the researchers on this project, and I'm happy here to present the report on behalf of my other colleagues, Lois and Sarah, who also contributed to the research. Perhaps to first say that this, as Kat mentioned, this report is part of a broader tracking mechanism that was growing out of humanitarian surge response in general. And this is actually the second, can I ask if you can just all mute your microphones? There's some sort of noise coming. I don't think it's from my side. What I wanted to say was, yes, thanks. So it's basically part of a broader tracking mechanism. This is the second report. The first report was on Nepal, and the next report will be on the response to the Bangladesh floods of July, August next year, which is currently being finalized. So on the Nepal earthquake, this one on slow onset, and the next one will be on the Bangladesh floods. So as Kat said, this really focuses on the operational agencies that are part of this project. You can see their logos on the report there. And basically, it's a rapid review. So we surveyed the agencies involved. We had interviews with field staff and also desk research to look at what other actors are doing, namely other NGOs, UN agencies, Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, governments, etc. So we have to take in mind that it's what we would consider a rapid review, and we don't aim to cover all surge response in all cases to slow onset crises. It must be said that there is not very much advice, literature, research reports in this area. So our report, apart from, there's not very much out there. So in this regard, we tried to summarize what we could find in this area. So basically, just to have so we're all on the same page, as we say, here I've just put what we consider sort of the definition of surge capacity for this project. As we say here, to basically, surging means basically to increase the resources available in a given location to stabilize or alleviate suffering of a given population. often we talk about sudden onset crises, like an earthquake, and slow onset crises. So we are distinctly looking at slow onset crises in terms of this piece of research. You can see the definition up here on the screen. Of course, there's some overlap between sudden onset, but slow onset crises has been recognized in this sort of broad description definition as I have up here on the screen. Now, if you look at sort of like the broad sort of, if we look around the sector and what people, organizations, academics, the media are saying, all the predictions are that these slow onset crises caused by climate change, extreme weather will only increase. And what we've seen is actually, there's been some concern, of course, because of the slow and inappropriate response and tools available to respond to slow onset crises. One of the main reasons is that many of the organizations that work in responding to emergencies are basically set up to respond to sudden onset crises, such as earthquakes, cyclones, also conflict as examples. So at the same time, what has happened is that, yes, there has been gradually some development on the side of the UN and some of the NGOs, Red Cross, Red Crescent, government, to develop slowly, as over time, new tools and mechanisms to try and better tackle slow onset crises. Of course, as we say here, just on the bottom of the slide, key factors that come up time and time again in tackling slow onsets is a question of funding, which we'll look at in this presentation. Also timing, when is the right time to increase resources to tackle slow onset. Politics, in terms of like governments are not necessarily willing to declare a crisis for a slow onset crisis for various reasons. And integration by meaning, how does responding to slow onset both integrate into emergency response programs on one hand, and into development on the other hand. And these things I'll touch on a bit in the presentation. So our findings, just in summary in several points, what was interesting in the findings was, firstly, that all of the agencies that responded to our survey that are part of this project have all used surge resources, personnel and staff, to respond, and personnel and or staff, personal staff and materials to respond to slow onset crises. So already this is surprising in that most of the resources, whether that be staff, materials, processes, policies, are actually set up to respond to sudden onset crises. So the fact that they have actually used these resources to respond to slow onset crises is perhaps surprising in itself. Once again, we're looking at just the agencies that make up part of this project, but they are active in hundreds of countries around the world. Also, interestingly, most of, if not all of the response in slow onset crisis is country-led. So it's not so much what we see in sudden onset, where you have a deployment of international staff or perhaps regional staff. Here, what you see is it's mainly country, national staff that are leading in slow onset crisis. Also, clearly, perhaps also different from sudden onset, there was a clear link, what we saw, between existing programs, often development programs in a given country, and existing partners. So where organizations had existing partnerships, they would use these to respond to slow onsets. Active in terms of where the agencies were active in coordination, food security, and water sanitation, and health to a certain extent. We found that our agencies were mainly active in Africa and the Middle East, and to a lesser extent in Asia Pacific and the other regions. And of course, that we did see examples from all over the world, but those that I point to are those that were raised by our agencies brought up. So on this slide, we see basically 3 examples that we highlight in the report, just to sort of explain a little, well, what does it actually mean by responding to slow onset crises. I'll just describe them very briefly. First, in India, in Andhra Pradesh area, where there was a 2000 drought, and Christian Aid, one of the partners of this project, one of the agencies, responded, working with local partners, mainly responded in water and sanitation, also livelihoods programs. How they did this was they brought in 2 staff to support in this region, one coming from New Delhi and also one coming from neighboring Bangladesh. So this really helped Christian Aid to really provide some support at a key moment in basically tackling that drought. In Papua New Guinea, this was where CARE were active in responding to an El Nino-related drought in 2015 and 16. Here they had a combined international and national team, so they did bring in some international staff to support. Important here was that they were able to carry out an assessment, a rather rapid assessment, which then helped them secure several million dollars in funding, which they could then integrate a more longer-term approach into their actual ongoing development and rehabilitation programs in the country. Zimbabwe, also an El Nino-related drought from 2015 onwards. This was where ActionAid provided an example where they were active. They mobilized in-country staff who had training in responding to emergencies. They were able to pilot a cash programming project, which also then led to them to be able to secure some extra financing to support them in responding to the drought. So that's some examples, and we give more details in the report. If we look at the challenges, what are the sort of challenges? And here I've outlined them briefly on this slide. I've sort of put in bold funding, because one of the main challenges that agencies did raise, and also supported by others in the sector, was, you know, the question of finding fundings to support slow onset crises. Why is this so? Well, it's mainly got to do with the fact that most funding is actually designed to support sudden onset crises, which is perhaps not a surprise for you all. Also, it is also, for example, difficult to use existing contingency emergency funds for slow onset. Some organizations are not set up to basically allow that. Some organizations are. And some organizations have to basically use their existing country level funding to try and do that while they try and secure other funding. For example, the example I gave of Christian Aid, they basically were able to mobilize their colleagues in the UK who were able to find private funding to support them. In other cases, funding from the UN and donors have also supported. Timing is another interesting challenge here, because timing is really the point of, for a sudden onset, it's obvious when the response should be, immediate as soon as possible. What agencies spoke about here was, the challenge is to determine actually at what point of time should they respond, because there's not necessarily in all slow onset crises a sort of a clear trigger or a clear moment when agencies should respond. So that's always a question. Access in terms of, for example, having access to the given affected countries, and also, of course, if staff are on the ground, this is less of a problem, but in some countries it can be a problem. For example, if a national government is not willing to declare an emergency, it makes it difficult, for example, for some agencies to bring in outside staff from the country. Perceptions internally is an interesting one, in that in some agencies, it was really challenging for the staff nationally, and also those working in emergency response, to convince their colleagues to consider slow onset crisis as a type of crisis, as organizations are mainly set up to work with sudden onset crises. So that was an interesting challenge that was highlighted. Collaboration internally and externally. Internally, in that more so than sudden onset, slow onset really requires a good collaboration between those working in emergency response and those working in development, rehabilitation, and long-term recovery resilience programs. Of course, this is an ongoing debate in the sector of how does emergency collaborate with development, and it's sort of polarized here, where it's often, of course, the development colleagues in the field that they will be supported maybe temporarily by other staff, but not perhaps even, and maybe by extra funding and support. So this is an ongoing issue. Collaboration also externally is that it's in countries where they have to provide extra support for slow onset crises in the response. They may not necessarily have the necessary contacts with donors, government agencies in the given countries, because it might be another range of actors that they're normally in contact with. So some challenges were seen in this regard. The interesting was the staff skill sets. This is an interesting point, that a lot of the staff, that particularly global and regional, that are trained to respond to crises are of course trained in sudden onset crisis response. In responding to slow onset crises, what we found is you need a slightly different set of skills. For example, you have to understand the transition, from emergency to development. That's where many agencies have some limitations. And also you have to be strong in needs assessment, donor relationships, and partner management, which is not necessarily some of the skills we would find in traditional responders to sudden onset crises. So where does that lead us in terms of recommendations? And these are just the last couple of points. Our recommendations focus mainly on agencies and humanitarian agencies and the agencies connected with the project, but of course, in general. We could perhaps even say more for donors and others, but our focus is on this. In brief, for example, in terms of responding into slow onset crises, of course, some early warning systems and approaches have been developed. How can they be further developed and triggers more clearly identified? We could also say, better use of existing tools, and also the ability to use assessment, of course, and to try and, ensure buy-in both internally and externally for the use of these tools. Because you do have some tools that exist, but you do not necessarily see them used widely across the sector and within agencies. Of course, to build awareness within agencies that, slow onset crises does, and have a relevance for surge. And even if funding, tools, staff are not necessarily always adapted, we're going to see increasingly the need to use these resources to respond to slow onset crises. And funding, of course, both for donors and agencies is, of course, recognize the need for funding, and also to make sure that, the emergency funding that many of the agencies have, they have emergency funding pots or pools, is to make sure that they can also be available for slow onset crises. Lastly, some points on recommendations in terms of staff setup. It would make sense to ensure that that staff that are in countries prone to slow onset crises, that they do have some training in emergency response adapted to slow onset. That was a case in Zimbabwe, and that really turned out as being, extremely useful for Action Aid and also for the other agencies. Of course, what would be also key is, as I mentioned before, if staff that are working regional, global, particularly responding to crises, also have developed skill sets relevant to slow onset, as I mentioned earlier. Lastly, of course, collaborations for agencies, encouraging a dialogue between emergency and development sectors within the agencies. Of course, as we know, as I mentioned before, this is ongoing work, and I'd say work in progress. Developing the contacts where necessary to facilitate, slow onset responses in the countries at the national level, and also, encouraging participation in new initiatives to respond to slow onset crises. For example, the START network, which is this project is part of, has set up a drought financing facility, which is also being currently piloted or initiated in Pakistan. So there are some interesting initiatives that are getting off the ground, which can be quite interesting. And I'm sure there's possibly others in United Nations and also Red Crescent movement and also governments. So at this point, thank you again. We'll just basically, I'll turn back to Kat and then we'll open it up to questions. So thanks again for your patience, and we have a good 30 minutes for some questions.
Thanks very much, Glenn. It's really appreciated. So as you said, we are going to move to questions now. I just wanted to say before we did that, after this call, Kadir will be sending just an email around to participants with some of the key discussion points and also a bit more information about the project for those of you who are interested. But now if we move on to questions, so I think maybe if, I'm just thinking the best way to do it, maybe on the, if people want to raise on the chat bar whether they have questions, and if you have a question, if you could say your name and agency or the organisation you're working for, and your question.
Hello.
Hi, who's this?
Yeah, this is Ahmed from Somaliland, ActionAid Somalia. I'm working with ActionAid in Somalia. So I have maybe two questions for the presenter. So the first question is around the value addition of the international staff to the slow onset disasters or crisis. So if you can make a comparative analysis of actually crisis being managed by internally or maybe the local staff or externally. So based on his experience and maybe the findings of the assessment or the research, whatever, and if he can actually expand more on that. Secondly, the issue of media in the slow onset issue, I mean the crisis, which means on the sudden onset crisis, usually it immediately grabs the media attention, and that's where the funding and all resource mobilization is happening. But then being in a crisis situation, as I speak in Somalia, what we experienced is the situation usually seems goes beyond threshold before the media comes in and actually communicates externally, and then the resource mobilization and everything comes in. So the issue of media in the slow onset and crisis is also area where we may need to discuss more on, and what is the appropriate time and what are the techniques of engaging media at the appropriate time before the threshold, all these things. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ahmed. Can I suggest we maybe take one or two more questions and then Glenn can respond to them kind of collectively. So any more questions in the group? We take maybe one or two more.
Sounds good, Kat. Yes, agreed.
Hi, it's Jock Baker here. I'm an independent consultant like Glenn and done a few reviews and evaluations of surge. I kind of echo my main question actually was just raised, which was the added value of internationals, because one of the things I've found when I've done these reviews and evaluations is interface is sometimes a bit tricky. On one hand, country level staff not sure how to use internationals optimally, and the internationals also don't necessarily clearly know what they're doing. Often this is due because there's sort of a template terms of reference that isn't really adapted. So slow onset crisis should give a bit more opportunity to fine tune these things, but I'm just wondering about that, what was found during this study. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jock. And I think maybe there's one more question which has come through from the messenger. So Ben, do you want to share your question with the group?
I think I posted it to everyone, but essentially, Glenn, thanks for the presentation. Just wondering what kind of data you've come across. Are there any treasure troves of data available to show where and when surge capacity is utilized, and so that we can start to compare that with media attention when funding's available, have a bit more of an objective comparison as to when it's utilised against humanitarian needs, please?
Thanks very much, Ben. I'll hand over to Glenn.
Maybe on that last one. Thanks, Ben. Hi, Ben. That's a hard one, actually. Yeah, exactly. I think some of the only data actually, which sort of is an indication. Yes, we didn't really look at media data, but of course, the feeling is that slow onset crises attract less media attention. That's the anecdotal feeling, which I think could be supported if we made a larger study. Some of the data that sort of is indicative is from, Ben, I know, is from the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, is like, for the Red Cross, Red Crescent and the UN, and to a lesser extent, some of the NGO networks where they have data available on how their appeals being responded to, for example. So their financial appeals. And that gives us some indication as to, how is the appeal being responded to, and therefore how are organizations able to respond. Of course, it doesn't cover everything, but it gives us a sort of a glimpse. I think apart from that, we are collecting over the period of this project, looking at different examples of surge, both slow onset and sudden onset. So we hope by the end of the project, coming up end of this year, we will have a collection of different tracking mechanisms that we'll be able to compare some information. That's what I would say on that point. I think on the question of both of Jock and hi Jock and Ahmed, Nabat, that's what I know in Somaliland. I think, yes, on the interesting thing I think about the whole added value of international versus country-led, I think in slow onset, what's interesting is sort of the default is that it will virtually mostly be country-led and international staff. We had the example in Papua New Guinea where there was international staff brought in, but in most cases it's basically led by national staff, and it's or people based in that given country, and then it's supported by, as we saw in the case in India with Christian Aid, for example, someone coming from a neighboring country. I guess the reasons why is also because these crises tend to be under the radar in a way, so it doesn't necessarily attract the attention fully of the organizations in the headquarters, not always. And so there is not the pressure also from the headquarters, which is also, we see that as Jock will no doubt have seen, the pressure to send international staff for visibility and for presence in these given contexts. So what I would say in summary on that point, I mean, what we have seen in slow onsets is actually the national, with some support perhaps from neighboring countries in some cases, it seems to be able to manage the response, where the international sort of headquarters have supported. In several cases we saw, for example, is providing advice and also supporting in the finding funds. So they still have that in important link. I think in some cases also, there is also some of the key technical skills that not all in-country staff have, but some obviously have. For example, the ability to write the necessary proposal to secure that funding from donor governments and UN. But for example, in the case of Action Aid in Zimbabwe, that was the case because they did manage to secure the funding, and that was all country-led. Lastly, I think for the question that Ahmed raised about the media also, and others touched on, yes, I think that, as I said, anecdotally, certainly slow onset crises attract less attention in the media because they don't, of course, have that newsworthy element that a sudden crisis such as an earthquake has. What can organizations do to attract more coverage? This is really challenging because organizations have to find a way to try and attract media attention. And that's often very difficult because media are, of course, interested in what they consider newsworthy. I don't think there's any magic solution, but of course, organizations will try and create case studies, interesting angles to a given situation to try and attract media attention. But of course, it's really very, very challenging because, of course, media attention has a link, I think most people would agree, to putting pressure on organizations to respond and putting pressure on donor governments to provide funding. I think there's clearly a link there. If it hasn't been scientifically established, I think it's probably there. Maybe I'll pass back to the group, Kat, if there's any other questions.
Yep.
Hi, Catherine. I have a question.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, this is Asif Jalil. I'm working associated with Clear Fund and looking for shifting the power project in Pakistan. And we have collaborated a lot with this project in Pakistan. When talking about this flow onset crisis, I have just few experiences or observations that I wanted to share. The problem that I mean, I don't know about Ethiopia or other countries, but in Pakistan, media did highlighted the drought situation in many instances. Even recently, Joint UN Mission has developed a report about the upcoming or incoming drought situation in some parts of the country. Now, the problem is, what I understand, is that for the slow onset crisis, you have to prepare yourself beforehand till the situation get worsened. And for that particular period, it's very difficult to foresee that situation is getting worsened and to mobilize human and financial resources during that particular period. So far, we don't have any mechanisms or indicators through which we can convince the donor community about any situation that is going wrong or getting worse. So that is I believe is the greatest challenge for the humanitarian community to show the donors or the organizations that the situation is getting worse. So far, we don't have any strong mechanisms in place. The second thing, yes, that was highlighted in the presentation was about that you need entirely different set of skills to understand and tackle the situation. And there is, yes, it is processed with development aspect as well. And yes, you're right. It'll be a kind of an ongoing discussion that how development and disaster is interlinked together. So this is just my take on that.
Yeah, Catherine. So can I come in again?
Yes, sorry. Thanks, Hassan, for that reflection. And yes, sorry, who's this?
So thank you very much. It's Ahmed again. So Glenn Nabat again. So basically, I want to raise the question to Catherine and Glenn together. So it's around addressing the underlying causes of vulnerability in the slow onset crisis. And that is what we are now experiencing. And all the resources mobilization and everything is around responding to the safety or saving lives, then addressing the underlying causes. So the question is how the project we are now discussing on addresses those underlying causes than the symptoms of the crisis. That's my question, or any other experiences you have, and how we can go about that.
Super, thanks very much. And I'm just going to check, are there any other questions from any of the other participants online? I think Cindy's sharing their screen with us.
I think it's Asim. I think you're sharing your screen by accident.
I don't think you need to share. So I'll just double check. Are there any other questions online? I'm conscious there are also some people in the room with me here. So yeah, any other questions that you'd like to share?
Asim, I think you're just sharing your screen with us. We're just looking at your emails, but
I'll see if I can turn it off from this side, if we can. Maybe if we share our screen, it will override. I don't know. Okay, we'll try and override it. There we go. Okay, so any other questions?
yes, that worked, Kat. Yeah.
Okay, good. Any other questions? No? Okay. In which case, Glenn, I'll hand over to you in terms of responding, and I can also add to Ahmed's question as well.
Yeah, no, I think as Asim raised a very interesting point for Pakistan, is that it's actually very difficult to foresee. That's one of the main challenges, and one of the indicators, and what I would say sort of triggers. If we look actually at the examples that we saw, what was kind of interesting was that what sort of triggered the agencies were what I would call as sort of mini crises within the slow onset. So there were certain peaks in time where actually the situation looked suddenly worse than it was previously. So it was like, if you like, I wouldn't like to say a small sudden onset within a slow onset, but there was something, certain points at times where the situation really came to a peak. And, you know, in a way we could say, you know, okay, that's great that agencies responded, but is that really, do we have to wait until those sort of warning signals become so prevalent? And I think, yes, to add to Ahmed, again, I think that's really the challenge. If I understood quickly, and Kat will add, no doubt, I think in terms of like securing resources, and once again, it's always what I've seen is an underlying challenge as we see organizations to be able to secure funds that will sort of address the underlying causes when organizations are not always able to get such funding, and we've seen that for many organizations. Although, of course, you know, thankfully, organizations are able to secure some funding for resilience and development work. Maybe, Kat, you wanted to add something?
Yes, sorry, I'm just checking I'm not on mute. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, I think in terms of that question, I mean the project is very much focused in terms of preparedness systems for organisations, and I think for us, you know, we're particularly looking at kind of common challenges that our agencies are facing. As Glenn said, it's sometimes in terms of funding to be able to respond in terms of our preparedness systems, but you know, agencies often have trouble in terms of sustainability for their surge systems. So just, you know, inadequate system funding in terms of making sure that preparations are in place to respond. Also, the other thing to highlight for the project is that we really want to look at surge at more localised levels, and how kind of surge systems that are set up can be integrated into preparedness plans in country. And so while we continue to, you know, obviously see a very important role for international surge, we think, you know, for too long that there's been a focus on international surge, and actually, you know, through the project we're trying to look at how agencies can build surge at more national levels and to support preparedness and to respond to some of those vulnerabilities. But, you know, I am conscious the focus of the project is more on preparedness. Hopefully that answers some of the questions. But as I said, we're hoping to send out, well, we definitely will send the communication out about kind of more information about what the project's doing. And I really wanted to highlight, as Glenn said, that we have been building a body of evidence on the project over the last 3 years, and really trying to pilot and build this evidence of, you know, how agencies can deliver surge more at more localized levels and in more collaborative ways. And we're actually building towards a kind of key moment for the project in October of this year, where we would like to present a selection of propositions to the sector on the direction we think surge in the sector will need to take in order to respond to an increasing humanitarian need. and that will cover kind of key topics such as financial sustainability for surge, but also, how agencies can better engage with key stakeholders such as the private sector or working with partner organisations or the UN. And we're also hoping to look at issues such as the role of women in surge or collaborative rosters. So I just wanted to flag for attendees here that that's going to hopefully be, certainly a very interesting moment for people in the sector to reflect on, what direction we need to head in. And so we'll keep those of you who are interested posted on our plans to make sure that you can be part of that process. Okay, I'll just double check that there aren't any further questions before. We do. We have a question in the room.
Hi, Glenn. This is Francisco. It's more a comment from the experience last year working with El Niño. And one of the obvious things, I mean, specifically on slow onsets related to drought, and more specifically with El Niño, which you can predict much more in advance, what the people who have followed that, the more technical people were saying that, yeah, the predictability is there, so you can. And there was discussion in the UN. They were setting, I think, led by WFP and FAO, kind of thresholds. So just a comment, and if you have come across that as, the UN playing that role, obviously with the leadership of the government. I mean, I think the government is important to work with them because it seems there is a discussion going on, as I said, on the specific case of, this was El Niño, but I guess in droughts, in climate-related disaster, and particularly droughts. So if you have to come out with that type of indication.
Yeah. Just that was Francisco from ActionAid UK.
Sorry, yes, I introduced myself. I'm Francisco from ActionAid UK. Sorry.
And then just finally, are there any other questions online to add to Francisco's?
Yeah, it's Jock again. I got my hand up. I don't know if you can see that or not.
Can't see. Please go ahead, Jock.
It was it was kind of following from your point about, developing in-country capacity, and also one of Glenn's earlier comments where he seemed to give an example about bringing from a neighboring country, and that reminded me actually of a real-time evaluation I led for the Red Cross in Nepal after the earthquake, where one of the lessons learned from Haiyan, actually, which they brought into Nepal, was to make greater use of their RDRT, the regional disaster response teams, and that was a specific question in the evaluation, and actually is quite good practice. Because what we found is that a lot of these people had already been to Nepal in sort of contingency planning exercises or some kind of other technical support capacity or workshops or whatever. So they were known entities, if you like, and they had much, obviously being from the region, they had much easier time of integrating into the Nepali context. So but I don't know, maybe I missed it, but I didn't really see that in the report, and wondered if that had been looked into at all, this sort of, obviously in country capacity, but kind of the next port of call would be region. Thanks.
Thanks, Jock. And I've also raised Niall from ActionAid, also has his hand up. Niall, are you with us? Do you have a question? Okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi.
Sorry about that. Yeah, quick question, and it's linked to some of the other comments, really. And one of the recommendations in the report around the situation response analysis framework. I guess really just a question about how widespread or how what's the awareness level in terms of the use of this tool, and is there scope to use this tool at a more collective level? For example, the grand bargain commitments around assessments. Is there something in a more collective approach to raising awareness of slow onset, and perhaps collectively or collaboratively using the tool like the situation analysis framework? I don't know what the authors think of those comments.
Thanks very much, Niall. I'll hand over to Glenn.
Thanks. No, some interesting points there. I think going back to Francisco about the threshold, El Nino and the droughts, I think it's the work that's being done. It's not really, from what I could see, very well known, and it hasn't yet sort of been disseminated in the sector widely. So when you go at the country level, I don't think it's really has reached that level from what I've seen talking to the people at the country level. But we have a narrow view also. You know, we didn't talk with UN people, which could have maybe have more information on that, and possibly, you know, through the cluster system, early recovery cluster, maybe, for example, this in some countries, this information is out there and is being used, but not that we saw widely. I think from the point of view of Jock, yes, the regional issue, using regional stuff is a sort of is a interesting and often a best practice, as Jock pointed out, as the example seen in the Nepal earthquake, and also we saw that also in this case in the slow onset response of Christian aid to the drought in India. So it kept bringing us stuff from Bangladesh. So it is happening. I think perhaps the main barrier is that, like, we know the Red Cross has this regional response teams set up virtually in most cases around places around the world, and it works relatively well. I think it's really the organizations that they have different sort of setups, and some of them have stronger ability to bring staff from neighboring countries and to bring them from a regional pool, and other organizations don't have that capacity yet or don't necessarily work in that way. But certainly, as Jock pointed out, everything points towards using regional, and I would say more so than regional, but neighboring staff, neighboring colleagues from staff does work. As part of this project also, there is the notion of setting up a regional roster from Bangkok, which covers the whole region, and basically pooling staff from all over the region from different agencies, with the idea that one agency can even deploy to another agency, and that's already happened with the deployment carried out. I think, yeah, the question of as Niall said about the SAF, which it's the assessment. I'm trying to recall what it stands for again. It's the assessment framework. What's interesting is that, yes, I mean, I would say the sort of the SAF tool actually is unfortunately not very well known, even amongst the agencies that created it. The situation response analysis framework. We didn't see it, widely used or referred to outside its initial sort of testing and use, which is perhaps we were perhaps just looking at limited amount of countries and information. So I think certainly we would say that it should be relooked at and revitalized, because it wasn't really clear for us who was piloting or leading on this at this point of time. Of course, I think, as Niall mentioned in the Grand Bargain, there is a particular point about joint assessments. And what we have seen is that, certainly the work done by OCHA, the work done by ACAPS on joint assessments does have certainly a lot of promise. And looking to what we did recently in the related piece on Bangladesh floods, which is our next piece for this tracking mechanism, we did see there was a very positive example of a joint assessment made between the main NGOs, local, international, and the UN, which was led by CARE, if I'm not wrong, CARE Bangladesh. Also what was interesting was that also fed in well into the information that was the joint assessment that was done by ACAPS, also contributed to that. So I think there's really interesting possibilities and potential in assessment. And I think agencies are seeing now the the benefit of having joint and what I would say sort of independent and impartial assessments where possible, because the challenge with agencies' own assessments is if your agency focuses on WASH, then what tends to happen is you come back and you say, oh, we need WASH because your agency focuses on WASH. Whereas the broader assessments tend to be slightly more independent in that regard. Not always, but from what I've seen. So that's just some feedback on those points. I think, yeah, some really interesting questions there and some points that were made.
Okay, super. Glenn, thank you so much for your time. I think maybe I'll just double check there aren't any final questions. I'm conscious we still have a few minutes left. So any final questions before we close? Or comments, reflections from the group? Okay. In which case, a big thank you to everybody for taking the time to join us this morning for this webinar, and from Glenn and the CHS Alliance for working on this piece of research and for sharing it with us today. As mentioned, we'll be back in touch with other resources on the project if you're interested in finding out more. And yeah, look forward to further discussions. Thanks very much.
Thanks again to everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.